A 4-year-old boy, a dream to save rescue dogs, and one act of kindness that changed everything. Jackson Bedchard's story is a journey of courage, compassion, and a movement no one saw coming. Are you ready? Charleston, South Carolina, was known for its warm, sunny days, tree-lined streets, and friendly faces. It was the perfect place for the Bedchard family to call home. Their house wasn't the biggest or fanciest on the block, but it had something more valuable: love. The Bedchards believed in kindness, especially when it came to helping those who couldn't help themselves. And at the heart of their family was 4-year-old Jackson, a boy whose love for animals made him stand out in ways no one could have expected. Jackson was small for his age, with messy blonde hair that seemed to have a mind of its own, and big blue eyes that sparkled whenever he smiled. But what made Jackson truly special wasn't how he looked. It was his heart. Even at 4 years old, he cared more deeply than most adults. His world revolved around animals, especially the ones that needed love the most. His mother, Mrs. Bedchard, was his biggest supporter. She had a gentle, nurturing spirit and a passion for rescuing animals. After years of living on military bases, moving from one temporary home to another, she was finally able to do what she loved: fostering rescue dogs. Their suburban home had become a haven for animals who had been abandoned, mistreated, or simply needed a second chance. Jackson was fascinated by the dogs they fostered. Each one had its own personality, and he took the time to get to know them all. There was Geo, the calm and loving Labrador who followed Jackson everywhere like a shadow. Max, the tiny terrier with a mischievous streak. Daisy, a shy beagle who took a while to warm up to people. And Bella, a lively spaniel mix who never seemed to run out of energy. Every morning, Jackson would wake up early, eager to greet his furry friends. "Good morning, Geo," he'd call as he scrambled out of bed and ran to the backyard. "Did you sleep well?" Geo would respond with a wag of his tail, as if to say, "Of course." Jackson's mornings were a flurry of activity. After breakfast, he and his mom would feed the dogs together, a ritual that had become one of Jackson's favorite parts of the day. "Geo eats first because he's the oldest," Jackson declared one day, holding the bowl steady as Geo gently licked up his food. "And Daisy gets her bowl in the corner because she's still a little scared." Mrs. Bedchard smiled as she watched her son carefully arrange the feeding order. It amazed her how much he understood the needs of the dogs, even at such a young age. "You're a natural caretaker, Jackson," she said. "Do you think they know I love them, Mom?" Jackson asked, looking up at her with wide, serious eyes. "They definitely know," she replied, giving him a hug. "And they love you too." But life wasn't always easy for the Bedchards. Jackson's father, Mr. Bedchard, was a Marine who was often away on duty. His long absences left a gap in their family, one that Jackson was too young to fully understand. "Why can't Dad come home, Mom?" Jackson would ask sometimes, his voice tinged with confusion and sadness. "He's helping keep people safe, sweetheart," Mrs. Bedchard would explain. "It's his job, and it's very important. But he loves you so much, and he'll be back as soon as he can." Jackson would nod, but it was clear that he missed his dad. The dogs became his comfort during these times. They were always there for him, ready to play, cuddle, or simply sit beside him when he felt lonely. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and cast a golden glow over the backyard, Jackson sat on the grass with Geo beside him. The other dogs were running around, chasing each other and barking happily, but Jackson seemed lost in thought. "Geo," he whispered, resting his small hand on the dog's head, "do you think Dad misses me too?" Geo tilted his head as if he understood the question. He leaned closer, pressing his warm, furry body against Jackson's side. "I think he does," Jackson said, answering his own question. "And I bet he'd like you a lot." You'd be best friends. Deepening Jackson's relationship with his mother and the dogs. Mrs. Bedchard had always been passionate about teaching Jackson the value of kindness. She believed that even small acts of compassion could make a big difference, and she wanted Jackson to grow up understanding that. One day, as they were cleaning the dog beds together, Jackson asked, "Mom, why do we have so many dogs?" Mrs. Bedchard paused, wiping her hands on a towel. "Well, Jackson, not all dogs have homes. Some of them are left behind because their families can't take care of them anymore. Others are treated badly and need a safe place to stay until they can find a new family." Jackson's eyes widened. "That's so sad. Can't we keep all of them forever?" "I wish we could," she said, kneeling down to his level. "But our job is to help them until they find the right home. It's like being their family for a little while before they move on." Jackson thought about this for a moment. "So, we're like their helpers?" "Exactly," Mrs. Bedchard said, smiling. "We're their helpers, and you, my little man, are the best helper of all." Jackson beamed at the praise, his small chest puffing out with pride. A moment of connection and innocence. One afternoon, Jackson sat in the living room surrounded by his animal companions. He was drawing pictures of each dog on sheets of construction paper. "This one is Geo," he announced, holding up a drawing of a big yellow dog with floppy ears. "And this one is Max." He pointed to a picture of a tiny dog with a scruffy face and a wagging tail. Mrs. Bedchard watched from the doorway, her heart swelling with love for her son. "What are you going to do with all those pictures?" she asked. "I'm going to make a book," Jackson declared. "A book about all the dogs we've helped." "That's a wonderful idea," she said, coming over to sit beside him. As they worked on the dog book together, Jackson suddenly looked up. "Mom, do you think the dogs know they're loved when they leave?" "I think they do," she said, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "Because they'll always remember the time they spent here, with us." Jackson nodded, a determined look on his face. "Then we have to love them extra hard so they never forget." Mrs. Bedchard couldn't have been prouder of her little boy. The day was warm and sunny, typical of a Charleston afternoon. The sky stretched endlessly above them, dotted with fluffy white clouds that seemed to float lazily across the blue. Jackson sat in the back seat of his mom's car, his excitement almost bubbling over as they made their way to the Charleston Animal Society. "Mom, are we there yet?" Jackson asked, bouncing in his seat as he looked out the window. "We're getting close, sweetheart," Mrs. Bedchard replied, her eyes on the road. "Just a few more minutes." Jackson's enthusiasm was contagious. His hands fidgeted, and his little legs swung back and forth as if they had a mind of their own. Every time they visited an animal shelter, it felt like Christmas morning to him. There was always something new to discover, a new friend to make, and a new way to show his love to the animals who needed it most. "I wonder who we're going to meet today," Jackson said, his voice filled with curiosity. "Maybe a puppy." "Well, I hope we meet a dog who's looking for a good family," Mrs. Bedchard said with a smile, her heart warm at the thought of her son's generosity. "A dog who needs someone to love them." "Just like Geo," Jackson replied, his eyes bright. "And Max, and Daisy, and Bella. They all needed us, and now they're happy." "You're right," Mrs. Bedchard agreed, her voice softening. "And that's why we do what we do. We're helping make their lives better, one day at a time." As they pulled into the shelter's parking lot, Jackson's anticipation grew. He could already hear the soft hum of activity from inside, the sounds of dogs barking, people chatting, and the distant clatter of food bowls. The Charleston Animal Society was one of the busiest shelters in the area, and it always seemed to be filled with both hope and heartache. "Let's go meet some new friends," Mrs. Bedchard said as she parked the car. Jackson unbuckled his seatbelt so fast, it almost looked like he was jumping out of the car before it had fully stopped. His mother laughed as she opened the door for him, grabbing his hand to steady him as they headed toward the entrance. Inside the shelter, the air was filled with a mixture of excitement and a touch of sadness. The dogs in their cages wagged their tails eagerly, as if hoping this would be the day they found a forever home. Jackson's heart ached a little, but he was determined to make the best of it. He believed that each dog deserved to be loved, even if only for a little while. "Hello, Jackson," a friendly voice called out from behind the front desk. It was Kelly, a volunteer who worked at the shelter and had known Jackson since he was a baby. She greeted him with a warm smile as he rushed over to say hello. "Hi, Kelly," Jackson exclaimed, giving her a big hug. "Are there any new dogs today?" Kelly's eyes sparkled as she leaned down to his level. "Well, we have some new faces, but I think you'll be especially excited to meet a couple of dogs who have been here for a while. They're really sweet." Jackson's face lit up. "Can I meet them?" "Of course," Kelly said, gesturing for them to follow her. She led them past row after row of cages, each one home to a dog with its own unique story. Jackson's eyes flicked back and forth, his little heart racing as he looked at all the animals. There was a small terrier with big brown eyes, a lab mix with a shiny coat, and even a giant Great Dane who seemed to fill up his whole cage. But none of them seemed to capture his attention like the two dogs Kelly was leading them toward. As they approached the end of the row, Jackson's gaze landed on two dogs sitting side by side in their pens. One was a large, muscular gray dog with a soft expression in his eyes, and the other was a black and white dog with a distinct spot on her head. Jackson felt a pull in his chest, as if these two dogs were calling to him. "This is Tank," Kelly said, pointing to the gray dog. "He's a big guy, but don't let that fool you. He's super sweet. He loves cuddles and belly rubs." "And this is Penelope," Kelly continued, pointing to the black and white dog with the spot. "She's a little shy, but she's also very loving once she gets to know you." Jackson's eyes widened as he crouched down to get a better look at Penelope. "I like her spot," he said, his voice full of wonder. "She looks like a real-life Dalmatian." Kelly chuckled. "She does, doesn't she? But her story is a bit sad. She was brought here after her family couldn't keep her anymore. They said she wasn't good with their kids, but we all know that's just because they didn't take the time to get to know her." Jackson frowned, his young heart sensitive to the idea that someone could give up a dog so easily. He reached his hand through the bars of the cage and gently stroked Penelope's head. The dog's eyes softened and she leaned into his touch, her tail wagging just slightly. "She's nice," Jackson said softly. "She is," Kelly agreed, her voice tinged with emotion. "But she's been here for a while, and we're hoping that someone will see how wonderful she is and give her a forever home." Jackson looked at his mom, his little face filled with concern. "Mom, can we take her home?" Mrs. Bedchard sighed gently, kneeling down beside him. "I wish we could, sweetheart. But remember, we can't have a pit bull in our new place. They're not allowed there, and we want to make sure we follow the rules." Jackson's eyes filled with sadness. "But she's so sweet. I don't want her to be alone." "I know, baby. I feel the same way," Mrs. Bedchard said, her voice thick with emotion. "But sometimes we can help in other ways. Maybe there's another family out there who will love her the way we do." Jackson wiped a tear from his cheek, but just then, something caught his eye. Tank, the big gray dog, was sitting up and wagging his tail. "Look, Mom, he's smiling." Tank looked like a giant teddy bear, his massive body towering over the other dogs, but his soft eyes and wagging tail made him seem more like a playful puppy. Jackson's heart lightened just a little as he reached for Tank's cage and gently patted the bars. "You're a good boy, Tank," he whispered. Just as Jackson was about to ask his mom if they could adopt Tank instead, something amazing happened. Kelly leaned in and whispered to Mrs. Bedchard. "There's something we can do, though. It's called the Guardian Sponsorship Program. Instead of taking the dog home, you can sponsor their adoption fee, helping cover the costs for the dog's new family. That way, you're still giving them a chance to find a loving home, and you're making a real difference." Before Mrs. Bedchard could even think about it, Jackson piped up, "I want to do that. I want to sponsor them." Kelly smiled, clearly moved by the little boy's generosity. "You want to help them, don't you?" Jackson nodded fiercely, his small hands clenched in determination. "Yes, I want to make sure they find a good family. I've been saving my allowance. I can use it to help them." Mrs. Bedchard looked at her son, her heart bursting with pride. "Are you sure, Jackson?" "It's a big decision." Jackson nodded again, his face serious now. "I'm sure. I want them to be happy." With tears welling in her eyes, Mrs. Bedchard nodded in agreement. "Then we'll do it. We'll sponsor them together." The ripple effect of kindness. When Jackson and his mom completed the sponsorship paperwork, Kelly took them to meet the staff, who were all moved by the young boy's kindness. Word of his generosity spread quickly throughout the shelter, and by the end of the day, Jackson's story had gone viral. People from all over the world shared the story of the little boy who used his savings to help rescue dogs. It wasn't just about money. It was about the love he had for these animals, and the way he saw the world. He didn't just want to make a difference. He wanted to show everyone that even small acts of kindness could have a big impact. The next time they visited the shelter, Penelope and Tank were no longer in their cages, but their story lived on in Jackson's heart. He had done something remarkable that day, and he knew that even though they couldn't bring the dogs home, he had helped them find the love they deserved. Jackson's heart was light as he and his mother made their way back to the car after leaving the Charleston Animal Society. It was a day he would never forget, not just because of the dogs he met, but because he had taken a small but meaningful step to make a big difference. He was quiet on the way home, and his mother couldn't help but notice the look on his face. There was something in his expression, something more than just happiness. It was a quiet pride, a sense of fulfillment. Mrs. Bedchard smiled, knowing that her son had not only learned something about love that day, but had also shown a kindness many adults would struggle to understand. "Mom," Jackson said after a while, breaking the silence, "do you think Penelope and Tank will be okay?" Mrs. Bedchard's eyes softened as she glanced at him through the rearview mirror. "I believe so, sweetheart. You helped them more than you know, and you'll be hearing about them soon. Someone out there is going to adopt them, and they'll have a chance at a happy life." Jackson nodded, his small hands folded on his lap. But deep down, he knew that no matter where those dogs went, they would always be special to him. They had been his friends for a brief moment, and in that short time, he had done all he could to make sure they would be loved. Later that evening, after Jackson had finished his dinner and his mother tucked him into bed, Mrs. Bedchard sat down at her laptop. She had been catching up on emails when one subject line caught her eye. It was from the Charleston Animal Society, and it read, "You won't believe what happened after Jackson's visit." Intrigued, Mrs. Bedchard clicked open the email, her heart racing with curiosity. What she read next took her completely by surprise. The email described how Jackson's gesture of sponsoring Penelope and Tank's adoption fees had inspired countless people around the world. The staff at the shelter had shared his story on their social media pages, and it quickly went viral. Not only had people expressed their admiration for Jackson, but they had also started reaching out to ask how they could help, too. The shelter's adoption fees for both dogs had been fully covered within 24 hours of Jackson's visit. But what was even more astonishing was that people from other states and even countries had begun to donate to the rescue shelter in Jackson's name. His small act of kindness had ignited a ripple effect that had spread far beyond Charleston. For Mrs. Bedchard, it was both overwhelming and humbling. Jackson, a 4-year-old boy with a heart full of love, had sparked a movement of kindness that had touched the lives of so many. The next few weeks brought a whirlwind of attention to Jackson and his family. Local news stations contacted Mrs. Bedchard for interviews, and his story was shared on various platforms. People from all over the world reached out to offer their thanks, praising Jackson for showing the kind of compassion the world desperately needed. But Jackson, with his innocent, unassuming nature, had no idea of the impact he had made. To him, it was just something he wanted to do, helping dogs find a home, even if he couldn't take them himself. In his own way, Jackson had become a symbol of selfless love. He was just a little boy who saw the world with a purity that many adults had long lost. He didn't see the flaws in the dogs' pasts, the stigma surrounding the breeds, or the complexities of life. He only saw friends in need of love, and that was all that mattered to him. At the same time, Jackson's actions also changed the way people viewed shelter animals, especially pit bulls. Penelope and Tank's story touched hearts across the world, and many people began to look at rescue animals with new eyes. No longer were they just shelter animals. They were beings deserving of second chances and unconditional love. One afternoon, while Jackson and his mother were at the park, a woman approached them with tears in her eyes. She was holding a small envelope in her hand, and as she reached them, she handed it to Mrs. Bedchard. "I just wanted to say thank you," the woman said, her voice shaking. "My husband and I had been considering adopting a dog for a long time, but we kept putting it off. Then I heard your son's story. It made me realize that there are so many animals waiting for homes, and I couldn't just stand by anymore." Mrs. Bedchard opened the envelope to find a check made out to the Charleston Animal Society. The woman had donated money, in Jackson's name, to help other dogs like Penelope and Tank find their way into loving homes. "I thought maybe my donation wouldn't make much of a difference," the woman continued. "But after hearing your son's story, I wanted to do something too, to show that kindness can spread, even to people like me." As the weeks went by, Jackson continued to live his life, unaware of the profound impact he had made. He played in the yard with his foster dogs, laughed with his mother, and went to school just like any other 4-year-old. But the shelter's success was undeniable. They had seen a huge increase in both donations and adoptions, all thanks to one little boy's love for 2 pit bulls. Jackson's actions had made people see the truth. Rescue animals, especially those with a history of neglect or abuse, deserve love, second chances, and the possibility of a happy life. And if a 4-year-old could see that truth, so could others. It wasn't just about adopting dogs anymore. It was about adopting a mindset that said, we don't give up on love, no matter how hard it gets. The ripple effect from Jackson's actions led to even more adoptions of pit bulls, especially in shelters that had struggled to place them due to the stigma around the breed. People from all over the country reached out to share their stories of how they had decided to adopt a rescue dog after hearing Jackson's story. One day, Mrs. Bedchard sat down with Jackson, the two of them talking quietly over a glass of lemonade. "Jackson," Mrs. Bedchard began, her voice soft but full of pride, "do you know how many people you've helped?" Jackson looked up from his glass, his innocent eyes wide with curiosity. "I helped lots of dogs, right?" "That's right," Mrs. Bedchard smiled. "You showed people that kindness can change the world. And now, because of you, so many dogs have found their forever homes." Jackson's story wasn't just a moment in time. It was the beginning of something much bigger, a movement sparked by the heart of a little boy who loved without reservation. As the years went on, Jackson would continue to grow, but the lessons he learned at such a young age would stay with him forever. He had learned the power of kindness, the importance of empathy, and the value of helping others, no matter how small or big the gesture. He had taught the world that anyone, no matter their age, could be a hero in their own way. And as for Penelope and Tank, the shelter received an update just a few months later. Both dogs had found their forever homes, thanks in part to the sponsorship program Jackson had helped start. Penelope had been adopted by a family who loved her gentle nature, and Tank had gone to a couple who had experience with large dogs and were thrilled to bring him into their lives. Jackson's journey had just begun. The kindness he had shown had already spread like wildfire, and his story would continue to inspire generations to come. Jackson woke up the next morning with excitement running through his veins. He didn't know exactly why, but the morning felt different. His world felt a little brighter. After all, the previous day had been one of the best days of his young life. His heart swelled with pride as he remembered his visit to the shelter and the dogs he had met, Penelope and Tank. He hadn't realized it yet, but he had done something extraordinary. As Mrs. Bedchard made pancakes in the kitchen, Jackson bounded down the stairs, his little feet thumping against each step. He was ready to face the day, ready to take on whatever came his way. He loved mornings like this, bright, fresh, and full of possibilities. His mother smiled as she poured the syrup onto his pancakes, but even she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. The day started just like any other. Jackson played outside with the dogs in the yard, laughing as the puppies chased after him. But this time things felt different. The air had a sense of anticipation, a quiet excitement, as if the world itself had noticed what Jackson had done and was waiting for him to take the next step. By noon, the phone began to ring. It was a call from the Charleston Animal Society. Mrs. Bedchard's heart skipped a beat. She knew that Jackson's story had gone viral, but she didn't realize how far-reaching it had become. The phone call was an invitation to visit a local event where Jackson could speak about his act of kindness. At first, Mrs. Bedchard hesitated. Jackson was only 4, and she wasn't sure if he was ready for such a big moment. But Jackson, with his natural warmth and enthusiasm, had other ideas. "Mom, I want to go," he exclaimed, his eyes sparkling. "I want to tell everyone about the dogs and how they need a home." Mrs. Bedchard smiled, her heart swelling with love and pride for her son. She knew this was his moment, the beginning of something greater. With a deep breath, she agreed, and together they prepared for the event that would forever change their lives. The event was being held at a large community center in Charleston. It was designed to raise awareness for rescue animals and promote adoption. Hundreds of people from all walks of life were there. Families, dog lovers, volunteers, and even local celebrities who supported animal rights. The room buzzed with conversation and excitement, but as soon as Jackson and his mother walked through the doors, all eyes turned toward them. Jackson was a small figure in a room full of adults, but there was something about him, something about the way he carried himself with such confidence and joy that made people pause and take notice. His innocent smile and wide-eyed excitement filled the room with warmth. He was, after all, the young boy who had sponsored the adoption of 2 pit bulls and started a movement that was spreading like wildfire. A microphone was set up on the stage, and Jackson's turn to speak was soon. Mrs. Bedchard held his hand as they walked toward it, nervous but proud. She never could have imagined that her son's love for animals would lead them here, to this moment, standing in front of so many people, all eager to hear what he had to say. When they reached the stage, Jackson grinned at the crowd, his eyes scanning the room. He spotted a dog adoption booth in the back, and his face lit up. "Look, Mom," he whispered, "they've got puppies." His mother chuckled softly and whispered back, "Yes, Jackson, they do. But we're here to talk about the ones who need our help the most. Remember what we talked about?" Jackson nodded, his little hand gripping the microphone. The room fell silent as they waited for him to speak. With a deep breath, he stepped up to the microphone and began to speak in his soft but clear voice. "Hi, my name is Jackson," he started, looking out at the crowd, "and I love dogs. I love all dogs, even the ones that no one wants." He paused, glancing up at his mom for support. Mrs. Bedchard nodded encouragingly, proud of her son's bravery. "There are a lot of dogs in shelters," Jackson continued, his words simple but powerful. "Some of them are big and strong, like Penelope and Tank. People think they're scary, but they're not. They just need love. I helped them. I gave my allowance to make sure they found a home, and you can help too. All you have to do is love them." His words hit the room like a wave, and the crowd fell silent. Jackson's honesty, his purity of heart, spoke to everyone. In that moment, he wasn't just a 4-year-old boy. He was a hero, a voice for the voiceless, someone who had touched hearts in a way words alone could never do. The applause that followed was deafening. People stood up, clapping and cheering, tears in their eyes. Jackson's mother could barely hold back her tears as she watched her son stand tall, a beacon of hope in a world that often felt too harsh. Jackson's speech was the spark that lit a fire. The ripple effect from that day spread across Charleston and beyond. That evening, social media was flooded with posts about Jackson's bravery, his kindness, and his commitment to helping animals. People shared his story, and it wasn't long before the hashtags #Jackson's, Love for Dogs, and #Adopt.shop trended worldwide. The local community center where the event had been held reported a significant uptick in adoption inquiries the following day. Many people who had attended the event walked away with a new sense of responsibility. They realized that adopting a dog from a shelter wasn't just about taking in a pet. It was about giving a life a second chance. Jackson's act of kindness had inspired a local movement, a movement that encouraged people to foster, adopt, and care for animals in need. Local businesses stepped up too, offering discounts to those who adopted rescue animals, and schools started organizing events where children could learn about responsible pet ownership. And for Jackson, the experience was like a dream come true. He continued to visit shelters with his mom, learning more about how he could help animals and spread awareness. But the best part for him was the joy he saw on the faces of the families who walked out of the shelter with their new furry friends. He knew, deep down, that he had played a part in making that happen. As time passed, Jackson's story continued to resonate with people from all walks of life. Schools invited him to speak, local animal shelters sought his help, and even national organizations began to recognize the power of his message. But the true impact of Jackson's kindness was seen in the small moments. The moments when families adopted a dog, when a child learned the importance of empathy, when someone chose to foster instead of turning away. Jackson had made a difference, not just in one shelter or in one community, but in the hearts of people everywhere. And as for Jackson, he never stopped loving animals. He continued to visit the shelters, always asking, "Mom, who else needs our help today?" His innocence and his unwavering belief in the goodness of the world remained, and it was that very spirit that would inspire countless others for years to come. The ripple effect had started with a small boy and a big heart, and it was destined to change the world, one adoption at a time. It was the kind of day where the sun shone brightly, casting a golden glow over the entire town. The air was crisp, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers from the park across the street. Jackson stood in front of his family's home, holding his favorite stuffed dog, Woofy, in his tiny hands, smiling from ear to ear. It was another ordinary morning, but somehow it felt extraordinary. Ever since Jackson's heartwarming gesture at the Charleston Animal Society, his life had been anything but ordinary. People from all over the country had reached out to him, praising him for his kindness, sharing his story, and most importantly, asking how they could help too. It was as if Jackson had unlocked something within people, an urge to care, to love, and to give back to the community in ways they hadn't thought of before. The days that followed Jackson's appearance at the event had been a whirlwind. His story had spread like wildfire, reaching not only people within Charleston, but also across the entire country. News stations picked up the story, and the hashtags JockerJacksons, Love for Dogs, and Foster for Love went viral. But what Jackson didn't know was that his story was just the beginning of something much bigger. It was a bright Tuesday afternoon when the knock on the door came. Jackson had been playing outside with his foster dogs, running around in circles, giggling as he did. He was always happiest when surrounded by the dogs, and today was no exception. His mother, Mrs. Bedchard, was in the kitchen, cleaning up after their breakfast when she heard the familiar sound of the doorbell. Who could that be? She wondered aloud, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She walked toward the front door, her curiosity piqued. She wasn't expecting anyone, but when she opened the door, she was taken aback. Standing on the porch was a woman she didn't recognize, dressed in a crisp blazer and a warm smile that immediately put Mrs. Bedchard at ease. "Hello, Mrs. Bedchard. My name is Laura Jennings," the woman introduced herself, offering a firm handshake. "I'm with the National Rescue Foundation. We've been following Jackson's incredible story, and I'm here to discuss how we might be able to work together." Mrs. Bedchard was stunned. She had heard of the National Rescue Foundation, an organization dedicated to supporting shelters and rescue operations across the country. The idea that such an influential organization would want to partner with her family was overwhelming, but she didn't hesitate to invite Laura inside. As they sat down at the kitchen table, Laura explained that the National Rescue Foundation had been so inspired by Jackson's commitment to animal rescue that they wanted to collaborate with him in a nationwide campaign to raise awareness for pit bulls and other misunderstood breeds. The goal was to highlight how children, like Jackson, could make a tangible difference in helping these animals find loving homes. Laura's eyes sparkled as she spoke. Jackson's act of kindness touched so many people, and we believe that together we can do even more. We'd love for him to be the face of our campaign and help spread the message that every dog deserves love, regardless of their breed. At that moment, Jackson walked in from the yard, his hands covered in mud, his shirt smeared with grass stains. He looked up at the woman sitting at the table and grinned, not knowing what was happening, but sensing something important. "Hi, I'm Jackson," he exclaimed cheerfully, extending his hand for a shake. Laura smiled, completely charmed by his openness. "It's so nice to meet you, Jackson. I've heard so much about you, and I think you're going to help a lot of animals." Jackson's face lit up with excitement. He didn't fully understand the significance of what Laura was saying, but he knew one thing for sure. He was about to embark on another adventure that would involve dogs. And to him, that was all that mattered. The following months were a whirlwind of events and opportunities for Jackson and his family. They worked closely with the National Rescue Foundation, and Jackson became a symbol of kindness, compassion, and the power of young hearts. The campaign, which they named Paws for Change, was aimed at educating people about the importance of adoption, fostering, and giving every animal a chance to be loved. Jackson traveled to different cities with his mother, visiting shelters and attending events where he would speak to families, children, and even adults, encouraging them to adopt rescue animals. He wasn't just a spokesperson, he was a living, breathing example of how small acts of kindness could have an immense impact. During one of the events in New York City, Jackson met a young girl named Lily. Lily had always wanted a dog, but her family had been hesitant to adopt a pit bull because of the negative stigma surrounding the breed. When Lily saw Jackson's speech and heard him talk about his love for dogs like Penelope and Tank, something clicked. After the event, Lily and her family decided to adopt a pit bull from a local shelter, and Jackson was there to help them choose the perfect dog. "I want to be just like Jackson," Lily said, hugging her new puppy. "I want to help dogs, too." Jackson's face broke into a huge grin. He wasn't just helping to find homes for dogs, he was inspiring a whole new generation of children who believed that they too could make a difference. The feeling of knowing that he had inspired someone else to take action was more powerful than anything Jackson had ever felt before. As the Pause for Change campaign continued to gain momentum, something extraordinary began to happen. Families who had adopted dogs through Jackson's encouragement started to share their stories. It wasn't just about adopting a pet, it was about how these animals had changed their lives. People spoke of the love and joy that a rescued dog brought into their homes, how the bond between them grew stronger with each passing day, and how the world seemed just a little bit brighter. One woman, Sarah, shared her story of how adopting a dog had helped her overcome her struggles with anxiety and depression. "I never knew how much I needed a dog," she said. "But after meeting my rescue, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. Jackson helped me realize that there's so much love in rescue animals. They don't judge you. They just want to love you." The stories of healing, hope, and transformation were endless. The campaign had not only saved countless animals, but it also helped people in ways that no one could have predicted. Jackson's simple act of kindness had sparked a movement that touched lives far beyond what anyone could have imagined. As Jackson grew older, his commitment to helping animals never wavered. He continued to be the voice for those who couldn't speak for themselves, always reminding people that every dog deserved a chance to be loved. His heart, full of empathy and compassion, inspired communities around the world. His legacy wasn't just about dogs, it was about the power of kindness, the belief that even the smallest among us can change the world. And as for Jackson's own journey, he had already made his mark. Every dog he helped, every child he inspired, every family who adopted a rescue animal, these were his triumphs. His story had become a beacon of hope for all who believed in the power of love. Jackson wasn't just an unlikely hero. He was a hero whose impact would echo for generations to come. The sun was setting over Charleston, casting a golden hue across the city as Jackson sat on the front steps of his home, a thoughtful expression on his face. It had been a few months since the Pause for Change campaign had officially taken off, and Jackson had traveled to countless shelters, spoken to numerous families, and even appeared on TV shows. But despite the success and all the love he'd received, Jackson knew something was missing. It wasn't about the fame or the accolades. It wasn't about the cameras or the interviews. Jackson had a different sense of purpose now, a purpose that was growing deeper and stronger with each passing day. "I just want to do more for the dogs," Jackson said to his mother, Mrs. Bedchard, who sat next to him, her arm around his small shoulders. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" she asked gently, sensing that something weighed on his mind. "I feel like I need to help more dogs, especially the ones who aren't getting adopted," Jackson replied, his voice filled with determination. "I don't want them to be forgotten." Mrs. Bedchard smiled softly at her son, proud of his selfless nature. She had seen firsthand how his heart for animals had grown since they started fostering. But Jackson wasn't the same child he had been when he first decided to sponsor Penelope and Tank. He was maturing, His compassion was evolving, and his goals were becoming bigger. "I think I know what you're saying," Mrs. Bedchard said. "You want to make sure no dog is left behind, even the ones who've been waiting the longest. Right?" Jackson nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. They need us." With his new goal in mind, Jackson threw himself into his work with even more energy. He started meeting with rescue shelters all over the state, speaking not only to families who were looking to adopt, but also to those who could offer their time or donations. Jackson was beginning to realize the power of community. While many people loved the idea of adopting a pet, there were still so many animals, especially the older, shy, or misunderstood ones, who weren't finding homes as quickly. It became clear to him that the key to helping these animals wasn't just about adoption. It was about finding ways to get people to see the value in fostering, volunteering, and donating, so that more resources could be put into helping animals who had been waiting too long. One day, as Jackson and his mom were visiting a local shelter in North Charleston, they met a dog named Max. Max was a middle-aged shepherd mix who had been at the shelter for nearly a year. He had a sad, soulful look in his eyes and a scar across his nose, likely from a past he couldn't escape. The shelter workers told Jackson that Max was a great dog, gentle and calm, but that many potential adopters passed him by because he looked too rough around the edges. Jackson knelt down in front of Max's cage, gently reaching through the bars to pat the dog's head. "You're just like the others," he said softly, his heart heavy. "You just need someone to see how special you are." After spending a few minutes with Max, Jackson turned to his mother, eyes wide with emotion. "We have to help him," he insisted. "I know, sweetheart. I know," Mrs. Bedchard said, understanding the weight of his words. But she also knew that fostering Max, along with their other dogs, would be a big responsibility. Still, Jackson's resolve was unwavering. In the weeks that followed, Jackson worked harder than ever to spread awareness about the dogs who were waiting for their forever homes. He started collaborating with local businesses to create donation drives and fundraisers for animals like Max, dogs who had spent too long in the shelters without a chance to show how lovable they truly were. One evening, Jackson's hard work paid off in the form of a new partnership with a local restaurant. The owner, Mr. Thompson, had heard about Jackson's mission and wanted to contribute. He offered to donate a percentage of his restaurant's profits on certain days to the Pause for Change campaign. The partnership was a huge success. People came from all over the city to eat at Mr. Thompson's restaurant, knowing that their meal would help fund the rescue and care of animals like Max. The event was even covered by local news, further fueling Jackson's growing reputation as an advocate for animals. With the extra funds raised from the event, Jackson's mother was able to cover Max's foster care costs. Max, who had spent so long in the shelter, was finally going to have the chance to live in a home, even if just for a while, and Jackson was thrilled. As Jackson continued to foster more dogs, he began to witness something incredible: a deep, unspoken bond between the animals he helped and the people who came to visit them. It was as if the dogs knew they were being given a second chance. They were so eager to love, so eager to show their gratitude, that it made the whole process even more meaningful. One day, when Jackson and his mother visited a shelter in a nearby town, they met a woman named Clara. She had been struggling with loneliness ever since her husband had passed away. Her home felt quiet and empty, and despite having friends and family, Clara felt like something was missing. When she met a shy dog named Bella, a golden retriever who had spent months at the shelter, she knew something special was happening. "I just have this feeling," Clara told Jackson as she held Bella in her arms. "She's the one. I think she's exactly what I need." Jackson's heart swelled with pride as he watched Clara and Bella begin to bond. The love and connection they shared seemed to fill the room with warmth. It wasn't just about adopting a pet. It was about how animals, with their unconditional love, could heal hearts and bring people back to life. However, not everything was smooth sailing. Despite his best efforts, Jackson began to realize just how many people still misunderstood pit bulls and other tough breeds. Some individuals were hesitant to adopt these dogs, fearing that they were aggressive or dangerous. Jackson had seen firsthand how these dogs, like Penelope and Tank, were some of the most loving animals he had ever known. Yet they were constantly overlooked. One afternoon, after an adoption event at a local shelter, Jackson overheard a conversation between two potential adopters. "I don't know about adopting a pit bull," one of them said. "They can be unpredictable." Jackson's heart sank as he overheard these words. He walked over to them, his small face filled with sincerity. "Excuse me," Jackson said, his voice firm but gentle. "I have 2 pit bulls at home, and they are the sweetest dogs you could ever meet. They just need love, just like any other dog. If you really get to know them, you'll see that they're just like the others." The adopters looked at him, surprised but moved by his conviction. "We'll think about it," one of them said, giving Jackson a reassuring smile. Jackson's simple words planted a seed of change in their minds. He was learning that sometimes the biggest battles weren't just about helping animals, they were about helping people see the truth. As time went on, Jackson's message continued to spread. His unwavering belief that every dog, regardless of its breed or past, deserved love became the backbone of his campaign. He didn't just want to change hearts for the dogs, he wanted to change hearts for the people, showing them that compassion could heal more than just a broken heart. Jackson was no longer just the little boy who loved animals. He was a force of nature, an advocate for change, a voice for the voiceless, and a champion for the animals that needed him most. The more Jackson worked, the more he realized that the road to change wasn't always easy. But as long as he had his heart, his passion, and his family by his side, he knew he would never stop fighting for the animals who needed him. It had been nearly a year since Jackson's mission to help rescue dogs began. What had started as a small campaign, fueled by his love for animals and his deep sense of empathy, had grown into something far greater than anyone could have imagined. But with this newfound attention came new challenges. As Jackson's voice grew louder, so did the expectations and the obstacles that came with it. Jackson was sitting in the kitchen of his family's home, his legs swinging back and forth from the chair. He was in the middle of an animated conversation with his mother, Mrs. Bedchard, his excitement palpable as he recounted the latest development of his campaign. "I can't believe it, Mom," Jackson said, his eyes wide with excitement. "We've raised enough money for 3 new rescue centers, and we're getting calls from all over the country. People want to know how they can help too." Mrs. Bedchard couldn't help but smile at her son's enthusiasm. He was no longer just the little boy who cried over the fate of a pit bull. He was now a powerful voice in the world of animal rescue, a true leader for the cause. "That's wonderful, Jackson," she said, her voice full of pride. "But remember, with all this excitement comes a lot of responsibility. You're becoming a symbol of hope for so many people, and animals. You need to make sure you're not burning out. We don't want you to lose sight of why you started this." Jackson nodded seriously. He had learned early on that helping others was incredibly rewarding, but it was also a lot of hard work. He wasn't just standing in front of crowds telling stories anymore. He was speaking at events, meeting with shelter directors, and even starting to create his own foundation to support dogs in need. The pressure was beginning to mount, but Jackson's heart never wavered. "I won't forget, Mom," Jackson promised, his voice filled with determination. "I just want to do more. I don't want anyone to feel the way I did when I saw those dogs waiting for a home." One evening, As the sky darkened and the stars began to twinkle, Jackson sat quietly in his room, looking at a photo of Penelope and Tank, the two dogs who had started it all. His room was decorated with posters of rescue animals, some of whom had found their forever homes thanks to his efforts. His walls were lined with photos of him holding up signs that read, "Adopt, don't shop," and "Give them a chance." But lately, the weight of his mission had started to feel a little heavier. For the first time since the campaign began, Jackson wasn't sure how much longer he could keep going. There were so many shelters to visit, so many animals to help, and so many people to educate. It was a lot for a young boy to handle, even one as determined as Jackson. As he sat, deep in thought, Mrs. Bedchard knocked softly on his door before entering. "Hey, kiddo," she said gently, sitting on the edge of his bed. "What's on your mind?" "I don't know, Mom," Jackson replied quietly, his voice tinged with exhaustion. "I feel like I'm not doing enough. There are so many animals out there, and I can't help them all." Mrs. Bedchard's heart broke for her son. She knew he carried the weight of the world on his small shoulders, and it hurt her to see him struggle. "You are doing enough, Jackson," she said softly. "More than enough. What you've accomplished already is incredible. And you're not alone in this. You've inspired so many people to get involved. You're giving people hope. And that's something more powerful than you'll ever know." Jackson looked up at her, his small face full of uncertainty. "But I don't want anyone to forget. I don't want the dogs to be forgotten." Mrs. Bedchard smiled gently, brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead. "Jackson, you've made sure they won't be. You've already created a ripple that's spreading all over the world. People are listening. People are changing. And it's all because of you." The weight on Jackson's shoulders seemed to lighten just a little, but he still didn't feel completely at ease. He wanted to be a voice for the voiceless, but he was still just a little boy. Sometimes the task felt too big, too overwhelming. A few days later, Jackson was invited to speak at a national animal rescue conference in Atlanta, Georgia. It was the biggest event of his young life, and the excitement he felt was tempered with nerves. He had never spoken in front of such a large audience, and the thought of standing on that stage, knowing that people from all over the country would be watching him, was both thrilling and terrifying. The night before the conference, Jackson couldn't sleep. His mind raced with thoughts of what he should say, how he could convey his message in a way that would inspire people to act. He wanted his words to make a difference, to light a fire in the hearts of those who heard him speak. "Mom, do you think they'll listen to me?" Jackson asked, his voice small as he sat on the bed, his eyes wide with uncertainty. "Of course they will," Mrs. Bedchard said, sitting next to him. "You've already shown them what it means to have a big heart. Now, you just need to speak from that heart. The truth always shines through, Jackson. And your truth is powerful." Jackson nodded slowly, feeling the warmth of his mother's words. The next day, he would take the stage with the weight of his mission pressing on him. But now, he knew he wasn't alone. The day of the conference arrived, and Jackson stood backstage, nervously adjusting his Pause for Change shirt. The room was packed with animal advocates, shelter directors, and activists, all of them waiting to hear what this young boy had to say. When Jackson's name was called, he walked to the stage, his heart pounding in his chest. He took the microphone in his hand, looking out at the crowd, his palms sweaty. "Hello, everyone," Jackson said, his voice shaky at first but growing stronger with each word. "I'm Jackson Bedchard, and I'm here to talk to you about something that matters more than anything to me. Rescue animals." He took a deep breath and continued. "I've seen too many animals, especially pit bulls and older dogs, waiting in shelters, just hoping for someone to love them. They're not broken. They're not dangerous. They just need a chance, and if we don't give them that chance, who will? The room fell silent as Jackson spoke from his heart, his words full of passion and truth. It wasn't a polished speech. It was just a young boy sharing his deepest feelings, and it moved everyone in the room. "I know it's hard sometimes," Jackson continued, "but I also know that if we all do just a little bit, whether it's volunteering, fostering, or just spreading the word, we can make a difference. I've seen it happen. I've seen the dogs get their second chance, and I've seen families change because of it." By the time Jackson finished speaking, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. His words had ignited something in the hearts of everyone present. The seeds of change were being planted not just in the minds of the audience, but in their actions as well. After the conference, Jackson's message went viral. News outlets picked up his speech, and social media exploded with support for his cause. People from all walks of life, families, businesses, celebrities, started joining Jackson's movement, pledging to help animals in need. Jackson's story was no longer just about him. It was about a community coming together for a cause larger than themselves. And through this movement, Jackson was beginning to see the change he had always dreamed of. As he sat with his mother that evening, watching the world respond to his words, Jackson smiled quietly to himself. He knew that his mission wasn't finished yet. But now, he wasn't just a boy advocating for animals. He was part of a much larger movement, a movement that was changing the world, one paw at a time. The world had begun to notice Jackson. After his inspiring speech at the Animal Rescue Conference, he was more than just the boy with a big heart for dogs. He had become the face of a nationwide movement. His story had spread like wildfire across the media, and the support flooded in from all corners of the globe. From celebrities to everyday people, everyone was sharing his message and rallying behind his cause. But with this newfound attention came unexpected obstacles. People who had never been involved in animal rescue before were now asking Jackson for advice. They wanted to help, but many didn't know where to start. Shelters were overwhelmed by the sheer number of donations and offers to adopt, and some even struggled to manage the incoming calls and emails. The movement Jackson had inspired was growing faster than anyone had anticipated, and the pressure was mounting on him to keep up with it all. One afternoon, Jackson was sitting in his room, his feet dangling from his bed as he scrolled through the hundreds of messages on his phone. They were filled with gratitude, encouragement, and pledges to help, but also with questions he didn't have all the answers to. How could people help more? What could they do to make a real difference? Jackson wanted to give them all a simple solution, but the problems were much more complex than he had imagined. His mother knocked on the door and entered, sensing that something was weighing heavily on her son. "Jackson," she said softly, sitting beside him, "I can tell something's bothering you. What's going on?" Jackson looked up, his eyes tired and filled with uncertainty. "Mom, I don't know if I'm doing enough. So many people want to help, but I don't know how to guide them. I feel like I'm letting everyone down." Mrs. Badeshard's heart swelled with pride and compassion. She knew this moment was coming. Jackson had always been selfless, always wanting to help, but now that the stakes were higher, he was feeling the pressure. "Jackson, you're already doing more than most people ever will," she said, her voice steady but full of warmth. "You've started a movement. You've made people care. That's the hardest part. Now you don't have to do it alone. You have a whole community of people who are ready to help. You just need to show them how." Jackson nodded slowly. His mother was right. The movement wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the collective strength of people coming together to create real change. Jackson decided it was time to take the next step. He reached out to the rescue centers that had been helping him since the beginning, including Charleston Animal Society, and suggested they hold a national event. a day dedicated to fostering, adopting, and volunteering. His vision was clear, a day where people could come together, learn about the animals in need, and take real action to help them. With the help of his mother and a small team of volunteers, Jackson began to organize the event. It was called Paws for Change, and it would be a day of activities, workshops, and, most importantly, a chance for people to meet the dogs and cats that needed homes. The goal was simple: to inspire more people to open their hearts and homes to rescue animals, especially the often overlooked ones like pit bulls, older dogs, and those with special needs. As the event drew closer, the pressure intensified. Jackson and his team had to coordinate with shelters, animal trainers, and volunteers from all over the country. The event was going to be huge, and the expectations were high. Jackson found himself spending long hours on the phone, organizing logistics, and answering emails. At times he felt overwhelmed, but he pushed through, driven by his love for the animals and his belief that this was the next step in the movement. The day of the event arrived, and Jackson could barely contain his excitement. He stood backstage, peeking through the curtains at the crowd that had gathered. It was larger than he had expected. Families, young professionals, animal lovers, and even local celebrities had come to support the cause. The energy in the air was electric. "I can't believe this is happening," Jackson whispered to his mother, his eyes wide with wonder. Mrs. Bedchard smiled and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "This is all because of you, Jackson. You've created this. Now let's make sure it's a day they'll never forget." The event began with a heartfelt speech from Jackson, who stood at the front of a large tent, surrounded by volunteers and supporters. He thanked everyone for coming and reminded them of the power they had to make a difference. He spoke about the dogs waiting for homes, the ones like Penelope and Tank who had taught him the true meaning of love and compassion. He talked about the need for more foster families, more volunteers, and more people willing to open their hearts to animals in need. Jackson's words were powerful, and they resonated deeply with the crowd. Many people in the audience were visibly moved, some even wiping away tears as they listened to the boy who had given everything for the cause he believed in. The day was filled with heartwarming moments. Families met their future pets, volunteers learned about animal care and rescue, and donations poured in from all over. The energy was infectious, and it was clear that Jackson's message had struck a chord. It wasn't just a charity event. It was a movement that was bringing real change to the world of animal rescue. As the day wore on, Jackson walked through the event with his mother, watching as people interacted with the animals, learning about their stories and the importance of adoption. He saw the joy on the faces of families who had just found their new best friends, and the relief on the faces of the rescue dogs who were about to start their new lives. "Mom," Jackson said quietly, looking at the crowd, "I never imagined it would be like this. Look at all the people who care. Look at all the families who are adopting. This is the change I've been dreaming of." Mrs. Bedchard smiled down at her son, feeling the same pride and joy that he was experiencing. "You did this, Jackson. You created this change, and it's only just the beginning." The success of Paws for Change marked a pivotal moment in Jackson's journey. What had once been a small idea had now turned into a nationwide initiative, with events planned in cities across the country. The ripple effect of his actions was felt far beyond his hometown of Charleston. People from all walks of life were coming together to make a difference for animals in need. As the movement grew, Jackson's voice became stronger. He was invited to speak at more events, and his story was shared in newspapers, on TV shows, and across social media platforms. He became the face of a new era in animal rescue, one that emphasized love, compassion, and second chances. But even as his success continued to grow, Jackson never lost sight of the most important lesson he had learned, that love and compassion could change the world. He had started his mission as a 4-year-old boy with a simple dream to help animals. Now, as his message spread, he was not just helping dogs, he was helping people rediscover their own capacity for kindness and empathy. As the weeks and months passed, Jackson's mission only grew stronger. His story was no longer just about one boy and his love for rescue dogs. It had become a beacon of hope for thousands of children and adults alike. His work with Paws for Change had sparked a nationwide movement, one that was changing the way people viewed adoption, fostering, and animal rescue. But Jackson knew this journey wasn't just about numbers or even success. It was about creating a legacy of love that would outlive him. By now, Jackson was invited to schools, animal shelters, and community events to share his story and inspire others. Every time he spoke, he was met with applause and admiration, but he remained humble, never forgetting the simple truth that had started it all: his love for animals. He didn't want to be seen as a hero. He wanted to be seen as someone who helped others see the world through the eyes of kindness. One morning, Jackson and his mother woke up early to attend a special event at a local animal shelter. It was a celebration of everything Paws for Change had achieved over the past year. Hundreds of animals adopted, thousands of donations raised, and countless people who had signed up to foster or volunteer. But this event was different. It wasn't just about the animals. It was about Jackson and his story. As they drove to the shelter, Jackson looked out the window, his mind swirling with thoughts. He knew the day was going to be special, but he wasn't sure exactly how. He didn't need any more recognition. He had already seen the power of his work in the faces of the animals who had found loving homes. But there was a part of him, deep down, that was hoping for something that would make all the hard work worth it. He wasn't sure what that something was, but he hoped he would find it today. When they arrived at the shelter, Jackson was greeted by the familiar faces of the staff, volunteers, and supporters who had been by his side from the very beginning. There were balloons, banners, and even a small stage set up in the yard. People were gathered in anticipation, their excitement palpable. But when Jackson walked into the room, he felt something different in the air, a quiet energy that made him feel like something important was about to happen. The shelter's director, a kind woman named Sarah, approached him with a smile. "Jackson," she said, her voice warm, "today is a special day. We want to honor you for everything you've done. We've been working with our partners, and today we're going to announce a very exciting new project, one that we hope will continue your legacy of love." Jackson blinked, unsure of what Sarah was talking about. "A new project?" he asked, his curiosity piqued. Sarah nodded, and then she led him outside to the yard, where a large crowd had gathered. In the center of the yard stood a huge wooden plaque, and on it were the words, "The Jackson Bedshard Rescue Center for Second Chances." Jackson gasped, his heart pounding in his chest. He turned to his mother, who had tears in her eyes. She wrapped her arms around him, pulling him into a hug. "Jackson," she whispered, "this is your legacy. This is what you've created. A place where animals like Penelope, Tank, and all the others can find their forever homes. A place where love and second chances thrive." Tears welled up in Jackson's eyes as he looked at the plaque. He could hardly believe it. A whole center dedicated to giving animals a second chance at life. It was everything he had ever wanted and more. The crowd erupted into applause, and Jackson felt a wave of emotion wash over him. He had never imagined something like this would happen. He had started this journey as a little boy with a dream of helping animals. But now, his dream was a reality. His mission had grown into something far bigger than himself. After the ceremony, Jackson stood on the stage, his voice steady but full of emotion as he addressed the crowd. "I never imagined something like this could happen," he said, looking out at the sea of faces before him. "But I've learned something important. When we work together, we can create real change. It's not just about adopting animals or donating money. It's about giving love. It's about showing kindness to the creatures who need us the most. And that's what I hope this center will be, a place where love never runs out." Jackson's words resonated with everyone in the crowd. It was clear that his message had touched their hearts, just as it had touched his own. As the event came to a close, Jackson was surrounded by people who wanted to shake his hand, thank him, and tell him how much he had inspired them. But Jackson wasn't interested in praise. He was focused on the future of the animals who still needed help, and the future of the children who would one day carry on the work he had started. In the years that followed, the Jackson Bedshard Rescue Center for Second Chances continued to thrive. More animals were saved, more families were united, and more people learned about the power of compassion. Jackson, though still just a young boy, had changed the world in ways that most people could only dream of. His legacy lived on in every rescued animal, in every family that adopted a pet, and in every person who had been touched by his story. But Jackson's journey wasn't over. He continued to inspire others, traveling the country, speaking at schools, shelters, and animal welfare events. He met with young children who shared his love for animals, and he encouraged them to never give up on making the world a better place. Every time he spoke, he reminded them that no dream was too big and no act of kindness too small. And in the quiet moments, when Jackson was alone with his thoughts, he often found himself thinking of Penelope and Tank. He remembered their faces, their personalities, and the way they had shown him the true meaning of love. He knew that it was because of them that his journey had begun, and it was because of them that he had found his purpose. As Jackson grew older, he became a symbol of hope and compassion, a reminder that no matter how small we are, we all have the power to change the world. And though he was just a boy when he started, Jackson Bedshard would forever be known as the boy who gave his heart to animals, and the world would never forget him. Thank you for watching. If you like this story, so don't forget to like and subscribe Storyboat for daily upcoming heartwarming stories.